They braced themselves for hatred and contempt. But the American soldiers arrived carrying trays of fresh donuts and coffee instead. November 8, 1945, Fort Sheridan, Illinois. 43 German women stood in formation outside a processing barracks, hands clasped tightly, shoulders rigid with anticipation. They were auxiliaries, former Luftwaffe communications operators, Wehrmacht clerical staff, and Nazi Party administrative workers captured during the final Allied push through Bavaria. For 6 weeks they'd been held in temporary camps in France, then transported across the Atlantic, and finally brought by train to this facility north of Chicago. At every stage, they prepared themselves for American revenge. The propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had broadcast was explicit. Americans hated Germans with murderous intensity. Captured soldiers would be starved, beaten, worked to death. Women would face worse: humiliation, degradation, violence too specific to name but horrible to imagine. The message had been reinforced constantly during the final months of the war as the Reich collapsed. Surrender meant suffering, capture meant cruelty. These 43 women had believed it completely. Most were in their early 20s, products of Hitler Youth indoctrination and 12 years of Nazi control over German education and media. They'd grown up in a system that taught them Germans were racially superior, that the war was defensive, that Allied forces represented civilization's destruction. By 1945, as Allied bombs destroyed German cities and Soviet armies advanced from the east, the propaganda had shifted to apocalyptic desperation. Better to die fighting than face what the victors would inflict. When Germany surrendered on May 8th, these women had been stationed at a communications facility near Munich. American forces arrived within days, rounding up military personnel for processing. The women had expected immediate violence. Instead, they'd been loaded onto trucks, driven to holding camps, fed minimal rations, and left largely alone while Europe's liberation chaos unfolded around them. That initial restraint confused them, but they'd rationalized it. Americans were waiting, building larger camps where systematic punishment could begin. The Atlantic crossing reinforced this fear. Crowded conditions, minimal communication, destination unknown. When they disembarked at New York Harbor and saw the massive city untouched by war, gleaming with lights and abundance, the contrast with destroyed Germany felt like proof of their defeat's totality. The train journey to Illinois had been long, but not brutal. The German women whispered among themselves, sharing rumors and fears. Some speculated they'd be put to hard labor. Others feared public humiliation, paraded through American cities so civilians could mock them. A few worried about trials and executions for war crimes they'd committed or witnessed. Greta Hoffman, a former signals operator from Hamburg, later described the prevailing mood: "We were terrified beyond words. Not just afraid of pain or death, but afraid of losing our last shred of human dignity. We believed Americans would treat us as we knew some Germans had treated others, with contempt, as less than human." That morning at Fort Sheridan, standing in the November cold, the women watched American soldiers approach with the resignation of those who've stopped fighting fate. They'd been told to form up for processing, which they assumed meant interrogation, assignment to work details, or worse. Most hadn't slept well in weeks. They were exhausted, malnourished, and psychologically shattered by defeat and fear. Before we continue with this remarkable story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Lost Portraits. We preserve the forgotten encounters of humanity found in war's aftermath. Leave a comment telling us where you're re-watching from. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these stories to light. Now, let's return to Fort Sheridan, where 43 German women are about to experience something that will challenge everything they believe. This is a story about the destruction of propaganda through the simplest possible means: ordinary human decency. It's about what happens when people expecting vengeance encounter generosity instead. In November 1945, as Germany lay in ruins and millions processed the horror of what Nazi Germany had done, thousands of German prisoners in America faced a reckoning. But that reckoning didn't take the form they'd been taught to expect. The women at Fort Sheridan represented a specific category of German prisoner: female military auxiliaries and civilian workers attached to Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe units. Unlike combat soldiers, they hadn't fired weapons or participated directly in fighting, but their service had supported the Nazi war machine. Under Geneva Convention rules, they qualified as prisoners of war entitled to humane treatment, but the women themselves didn't believe Americans would honor such rules. Their propaganda training had been comprehensive. From childhood, they'd been taught that Germans were locked in an existential struggle against inferior races and hostile powers. When Germany began losing, the propaganda shifted. Now the enemy wanted not just military defeat, but German extinction, collective punishment for daring to challenge Allied dominance. The psychological preparation for defeat had been particularly intense for women. Nazi ideology had celebrated German women as mothers and homemakers, pure vessels of racial continuity. To fall into enemy hands meant not just personal violation, but racial contamination, the destruction of everything Nazi womanhood supposedly represented. Standing in that cold Illinois morning, the 43 women carried all this conditioning. Most had never traveled outside Germany before the war. None had significant interaction with Americans. Their entire understanding came from Nazi propaganda films, controlled media, and rumors. They expected monsters because monsters were all they'd been shown. What they got instead was Captain Richard Walsh from Boston, walking toward them alongside soldiers carrying trays covered with white cloths. Walsh was 34, a former insurance adjuster who'd been drafted in 1942 and worked his way up to running prisoner processing at Fort Sheridan. He'd overseen thousands of German POWs and developed a philosophy about their treatment that went beyond Geneva Convention minimums. These people have been fed lies their entire lives, he told his staff the previous evening. They've been taught we're savages. I want tomorrow's first impression to prove we're not. I want cognitive dissonance so strong they can't maintain their propaganda worldview. The white cloths came off the trays, revealing dozens of fresh donuts, glazed, powdered, chocolate-covered, still warm from the base bakery, alongside thermoses of hot coffee with actual cream and sugar. The smell hit the German women before they fully processed what they were seeing: yeast and sugar and fat, the aroma of abundance. Captain Walsh, through his interpreter, delivered a short speech. You are prisoners of war. You will be treated according to Geneva Convention standards. You will not be harmed. You will not be starved. Before we begin processing, we thought you might be hungry. Please, help yourselves. 43 German women stood frozen, staring at donuts and coffee, unable to reconcile this reality with everything they'd been taught about American cruelty. In that moment of cognitive dissonance, the first crack appeared in the propaganda wall they'd lived behind their entire lives.
To understand the depth of these women's shock, we need to travel back 3 years, to 1942, when most first entered military or party service. By 1942, Nazi Germany's initial military successes had stalled. The Soviet invasion had bogged down into brutal attritional warfare. American entry meant fighting on multiple fronts against increasingly powerful enemies. The German war economy required total mobilization, including women. Nazi ideology had always been contradictory about women's roles. The propaganda celebrated the German mother, keeper of the home, producer of racially pure children. But practical necessity forced compromise. As millions of men went to the front, women filled gaps in factories, offices, communications networks, and administrative functions. By 1943, over 500,000 German women served in military auxiliary roles. Greta Hoffmann had been recruited in 1943 at age 19, directly from her position as a telegraph operator in Hamburg's main post office. A Luftwaffe officer came with papers, she recalled in her 1968 memoir. He didn't ask if we wanted to serve. He informed us we'd been selected. Refusal wasn't mentioned as an option. My parents were proud. Serving meant our family was contributing to Germany's survival. The training these women received was brief but intensive. Technical skills for their specific roles, basic military discipline, and constant ideological reinforcement. Nazi political officers delivered regular lectures about the war's existential nature, about German racial superiority, about the subhuman enemies surrounding the Reich. The training specifically addressed what to expect if captured. They told us Americans and British treated prisoners as slaves, Greta wrote, that Russians tortured and killed everyone, that surrender meant shame worse than death. They showed us propaganda films of supposed Allied atrocities, starving prisoners, public executions, humiliation. We believed them because we had no alternative information. The women were also taught that their honor as German women was at stake. Nazi ideology linked female purity to racial survival. Propaganda explicitly suggested that Allied soldiers would violate captured German women. The implication was clear. Death was preferable to such dishonor. This messaging intensified as Germany's military situation deteriorated. By late 1944, as Allied forces advanced from both east and west, propaganda shifted from confident victory predictions to desperate warnings about catastrophe. Radio broadcasts described supposed Soviet atrocities, implying Western allies would behave similarly. Goebbels' speeches explicitly told Germans that surrender meant national extinction. For women serving in communications and administrative roles, this created profound psychological pressure. They weren't combat soldiers capable of dying in battle. If Germany lost, they'd be captured alive, and capture, according to everything they'd been taught, meant horrors beyond imagination. The women stationed near Munich experienced Germany's collapse in compressed form. Through early 1945, they'd intercepted increasingly desperate military communications, watched supply lines collapse, processed reports of cities destroyed. When Hitler's suicide was announced, followed by unconditional surrender, the women faced a terrible choice: flee and blend into the civilian population, or await capture as military personnel. Most chose to stay with their units, partially because escape offered no real safety, but also because Nazi training had instilled rigid discipline. We had been taught that duty transcended personal survival, Greta explained. Abandoning our posts felt worse than facing capture. The American forces that reached their facility on May 11, 1945, were efficient rather than vengeful. Military police secured the compound, disarmed guards, and assembled personnel for processing. The women had prepared for violence, but instead experienced bureaucratic routine: names recorded, information gathered, temporary accommodations assigned. This confused them more than it reassured them. We kept waiting for the cruelty to begin, Greta recalled. Every moment of restraint felt like delay before inevitable punishment. We couldn't imagine Americans were actually following rules. The weeks in temporary camps in France reinforced this uncertainty. Conditions were basic: tents, minimal rations, no amenities, but not deliberately cruel. The women were held separately from male prisoners, guarded but not abused. American and British personnel processed thousands of POWs with mechanical efficiency. During this period, the German women encountered other prisoners with different experiences. Some had been captured earlier and reported decent treatment. Others had suffered genuine deprivation when Allied resources were stretched thin. The women struggled to reconcile varying accounts with their propaganda conditioning. The Atlantic crossing in October 1945 brought new fears. They were being transported to America itself, the heart of enemy territory, thousands of miles from home. The propaganda about America had been particularly intense: a mongrelized nation without true culture, dominated by Jewish capitalism, motivated by materialistic greed. When they arrived in New York and saw the city's intact buildings, bustling ports, and obvious prosperity, the contrast with bombed German cities was devastating. I realized then how completely we'd been defeated, Greta wrote, not just militarily but in every way. While our cities burned, America built. While we starved, they prospered. The train journey to Illinois took them through American heartland. Farms producing abundant food, small towns untouched by war, a country existing in a reality completely different from what they'd known. For women who'd grown up where rationing began before the war and deprivation had become normal, American abundance seemed almost obscene. By the time they arrived at Fort Sheridan in early November, the 43 women had spent 6 months in captivity without experiencing the cruelty they'd been promised. But they hadn't stopped believing it would come. They'd simply concluded Americans were delaying punishment, perhaps waiting for proper facilities. Standing in formation that cold morning, exhausted and frightened, they prepared themselves for processing. They assumed would finally reveal American vindictiveness. Some had rehearsed stories they hoped would minimize their culpability. Others had resigned themselves to whatever fate awaited. None were prepared for donuts. The cognitive dissonance that struck them when Captain Walsh's soldiers uncovered those trays was profound. This wasn't minimal Geneva Convention compliance. This wasn't neutral maintenance of prisoners. This was hospitality. This was abundance freely offered. This was the gesture you'd make to guests, not to defeated enemies. And it made absolutely no sense within the worldview they'd been taught their entire lives, which meant either the donuts were poisoned or the propaganda had been lying. In the next few minutes, they'd have to decide which explanation they believed. For approximately 90 seconds, no one moved. 43 German women stood frozen, staring at donuts they didn't dare touch. The silence had weight. Captain Walsh had expected hesitation, but the complete paralysis surprised him. Through his interpreter, Sergeant Frederick Muller, he thought a German-born American who'd left Berlin in 1936. He tried again. "The food is for you. It's not poisoned. It's not a trick. You must be hungry. Please, eat." Still no movement. The women's faces showed fear, confusion, and something close to despair. They wanted to believe the food was safe, but their conditioning ran too deep. Greta Hoffman later described her thoughts. "I kept thinking, this is how they'll do it. Make us eat poisoned food, or drug us so we're helpless." Every possibility my mind generated was sinister because I'd been taught Americans were fundamentally malicious. Captain Walsh recognized the impasse. He'd dealt with German POWs for months, mostly male soldiers who'd arrived with similar propaganda conditioning. These women seemed paralyzed by deeper fear, something beyond normal prisoner wariness. He decided on a direct approach. Walsh walked to the nearest tray, picked up a chocolate-covered donut, and took a substantial bite. He chewed deliberately, swallowed, smiled, and took another bite. Then he poured himself coffee, added cream and sugar, and drank. "See?" he said through Muller's translation. "Just food, just coffee, nothing sinister. Your turn." The woman closest to Walsh, later identified as Inga Schmidt, age 22, former signals operator from Berlin, watched intensely. Walsh held out the tray toward her, still smiling, waiting. Inga's hand trembled as she reached forward. She selected a plain glazed donut and lifted it to her nose. Yeast, sugar, nothing obviously wrong. Then she took the smallest possible bite and waited. Sweetness flooded her mouth. Real sugar, not saccharin substitute. Actual butter, not margarine or ersatz fat. The texture was soft and fresh, not the dense, gritty bread German rations had become. It tasted like childhood from before the war, when food could be pleasure rather than mere fuel. She took another bite, larger this time. Then another. Within 30 seconds, she'd finished the entire donut and was staring at the tray with undisguised hunger. Walsh gestured for her to take another. She did, and also accepted the coffee Sergeant Muller offered. That broke the dam. One by one, the other women approached the trays. Some remained cautious, selecting single items and eating slowly. Others, once they'd overcome initial fear, ate with desperate intensity. The American soldiers moved efficiently, distributing food and pouring coffee, maintaining friendly demeanor without forcing interaction. Within 15 minutes, 43 German women were eating donuts and drinking coffee, experiencing the first abundant meal most had seen since before D-Day. Several were crying as they ate, overwhelmed by the collision between expectation and reality. Others seemed dazed, mechanically consuming food while their minds struggled to process what was happening. Greta Hoffman took her donut and coffee to the edge of the formation, eating slowly while watching the Americans. "I was trying to find the angle," she later explained. "The manipulation, the hidden cruelty, the purpose behind this kindness. I'd been trained to believe Americans didn't do anything without calculated motivation. But I watched those soldiers distributing food, and they just looked normal. Young men doing a job, treating it as routine rather than special. That ordinariness was almost more disturbing than if they'd been theatrical about it." After the donuts came processing, and here the women's fears resurged. They were directed into the barracks one at a time for medical examination. This was the moment many had dreaded most: vulnerability, isolation, potential for abuse away from witnesses. Instead, they encountered Lieutenant Dr. Helen Morrison, a 32-year-old physician from Chicago, and her staff of female nurses. The examinations took place in a private room with a female interpreter present. The protocol was standard military medical intake: check for illness, document injuries, test for contagious diseases, provide treatment for immediate health concerns. Dr. Morrison had seen hundreds of German POWs and understood the particular fears German women brought to medical examination. She'd instructed her staff to maintain absolute professionalism, to explain every step, to move slowly and give prisoners time to comprehend what was happening. Each prisoner was checked for malnutrition. Nearly all showed signs of chronic food shortage. Several had untreated dental problems. A few had infections or persistent coughs requiring medication. One woman had a partially healed wrist fracture that hadn't been properly set. Dr. Morrison arranged for an orthopedist to examine it the following day. Every woman also received a hygiene kit: soap, toothbrush and powder, comb, basic cosmetics, sanitary supplies, and towels. These mundane items felt like luxuries to women who'd been making do with harsh ersatz products or nothing at all for years. When Inga Schmidt received her soap and actually smelled it, lilac-scented, gentle, she looked at the American nurse with open confusion. "Why?" she asked through the interpreter. "Why give us this?" The nurse, a young woman from Ohio named Sarah Chen, seemed genuinely puzzled. "Because you'll need it," she responded. "Everyone needs soap. You're not animals. You're prisoners, which means we're responsible for your basic needs. That includes hygiene." That exchange struck Ing with unexpected force. "You're not animals." The American nurse had said it so casually as self-evident, but Nazi propaganda had taught that Americans viewed defeated Germans as less than human, as vermin to be exterminated. Yet, here was casual acknowledgement of shared humanity, delivered without ceremony as simple fact. By late afternoon, all 43 women had been processed medically, provided with clean military surplus clothing, and assigned to barracks in the women's POW compound. The barracks were basic but weatherproof: wooden buildings with iron bunk beds, mattresses, blankets, a wood stove for heat, and bathroom facilities with running water. That evening, they were served dinner: meat stew with vegetables, bread with real butter, canned fruit, and milk. The portions were substantial, the quality far superior to what they'd eaten in years. That night, sleeping in actual beds for the first time in months, Greta lay awake listening to other women processing their disbelief. Some cried quietly. Others talked in whispers, trying to make sense of treatment that contradicted everything they'd expected. The Americans had offered donuts instead of degradation, and nothing in their Nazi education had prepared them for that simple act of humanity. Trust. Once destroyed by totalitarian propaganda, rebuilds slowly through accumulated small moments that contradict the lies. During their first week at Fort Sheridan, the 43 German women maintained careful emotional distance. They performed assigned tasks, cleaning, laundry, basic maintenance work, with German efficiency but minimal interaction with American personnel. They ate the abundant food provided but didn't relax into enjoyment. They remained perpetually ready for conditions to change, for decent treatment to drop and reveal expected cruelty. The American staff, to their credit, didn't force familiarity. Captain Walsh had instructed personnel to maintain professional courtesy, provide services as required, and otherwise give prisoners space to adjust. This restraint worked better than aggressive friendliness would have. It communicated that decent treatment wasn't contingent on gratitude or cooperation. It was simply policy. The first significant crack in the emotional wall came from music. Fort Sheridan's base recreation hall hosted weekly dances for American troops and civilian staff. Music from these events carried across the compound on clear evenings. Big band swing, popular songs, the sounds of people enjoying themselves. For German women who'd grown up with Nazi-controlled culture and spent years in wartime austerity, American popular music represented something both foreign and oddly appealing. One evening in late November, about 3 weeks into captivity, several women were outside their barracks when Sentimental Journey drifted across from the recreation hall. Inga Schmidt, who'd studied music before the war, began humming along, working out the melody. Another woman, Marta Vogel, a former cabaret singer from Munich conscripted into Wehrmacht entertainment services, started singing in English she'd learned at school. An American sergeant passing by stopped to listen. Instead of ordering them inside, he simply stood there appreciating the music. When Marta finished, he applauded and said something in English that made the interpreter laugh and translate, "That was beautiful. You should come sing at our dance sometime." He was joking, but the warmth in his voice was genuine. That small moment, appreciation for talent regardless of nationality, acknowledgement of artistry that transcended enmity, planted a seed. The women began to understand that Americans could see them as individuals rather than just enemy prisoners. Other gestures accumulated. Lieutenant Morrison brought aspirin to women suffering from chronic headaches. A guard who spoke no German learned to say "good morning" in their language and repeated it cheerfully during his rounds. When one woman mentioned missing her family's Christmas traditions, an American nurse brought her materials to make simple decorations. The women began responding. Hannah Weber, who'd been a seamstress before the war, offered to repair torn uniforms for American staff. Her skilled work impressed the quartermaster, who provided her with better materials. Soon, other women were contributing their pre-war skills. One helped in the base library, another assisted in the kitchen. A third worked with the medical staff using her nursing training. Working alongside Americans, they observed things propaganda had never prepared them for: the casual egalitarianism, officers and enlisted personnel interacting without rigid hierarchy, the racial diversity, black soldiers, Japanese Americans, immigrants from dozens of countries, all serving together, the kindness between colleagues, the jokes, the humanity. I watched a black American soldier and a white American soldier sharing coffee and laughing together, Greta wrote in her memoir. We'd been taught that America was torn apart by racial conflict, that different races hated each other. But here they were, just being human together. It was such a small thing, but it shattered another piece of propaganda. In early December, Fort Sheridan received care packages for troops: cookies, candy, letters from home. Several American soldiers, without being asked, shared treats with the German prisoners. A corporal from Texas gave Ing a Hershey bar. A private from New York shared cookies his mother had sent. "Why are you being kind to us?" Ing asked through the interpreter. "We were your enemies." The corporal shrugged. "War's over. You're just people now. Besides, it's Christmas season. Everybody deserves something sweet at Christmas. That casual generosity, treating Christmas as reason enough for kindness, seeing shared humanity as more important than past enmity, moved the women profoundly. Many had been raised in a system that emphasized collective identity over individual humanity, that taught them worth came from racial purity and national service. American individualism, the idea that each person deserved basic decency regardless of group membership, was revelatory. By mid-December, the barracks that had been silent for weeks became almost social. Women laughed occasionally, conversed with guards through interpreters, even made jokes. When one of the American nurses had a birthday, the German women used scraps of paper and fabric to create simple decorations as a gift. Lieutenant Morrison cried when she saw them. But transformation isn't linear. One afternoon in late December, news arrived about the Nuremberg trials, where top Nazi leaders faced prosecution for war crimes. The American staff expected this might disturb the German prisoners, forcing them to confront their nation's atrocities. That evening, Captain Walsh arranged for the women to listen to radio broadcasts about the trials. Through interpreters, they heard testimony about concentration camps, mass murder, systematic genocide. For many, this was the first time they'd heard comprehensive evidence of what their government had done. The reaction was complex. Some women claimed they'd known nothing. True for many auxiliaries who'd served in isolated roles. Others admitted they'd heard rumors but dismissed them as Allied propaganda. A few broke down, confronting the reality that their service, however indirect, had supported monstrous evil. Greta Hoffman sat in the barracks that night, processing what she'd heard. "I kept thinking about the American soldiers who gave us donuts," she later wrote. "They knew what Germany had done. They knew about the camps, the murders, the horror. And yet they still treated us with decency. They didn't make us starve, didn't abuse us, didn't treat us as less than human even though our nation had treated others exactly that way." That restraint, that commitment to principle even when facing people whose government had committed atrocities, it taught me more about morality than 12 years of Nazi education ever did. The Christmas of 1945 arrived quietly. The Americans decorated the compound, played carols over loudspeakers, served a special holiday meal. They didn't force the German prisoners to participate, but they didn't exclude them either. Several women attended voluntary chapel services. Others simply enjoyed the day of rest. On Christmas Eve, Marta Vogel sang Silent Night in German while an American soldier played guitar. Others joined in, German women singing in their language, American personnel humming along. For a few minutes, the barracks felt like a place where former enemies could simply be humans sharing a moment of peace. That night, Inga Schmidt wrote in the journal she'd been keeping, "We came here expecting monsters and found people. We expected cruelty and found donuts. We expected punishment and found grace we didn't deserve. I don't know how to be German anymore after this." The women learned of their repatriation in January 1946. They'd be returning to Germany, but to a Germany transformed by total defeat, occupation, devastation, and the beginning of a reckoning with Nazi atrocities. The news brought mixed emotions. Home meant family, familiar language, cultural comfort. But it also meant returning to a shattered nation, explaining survival to a society that had taught them death was preferable to capture, carrying knowledge about American humanity that contradicted what many Germans still believed. The journey back took 6 weeks, by train to New York, by ship to Bremerhaven, then by military transport to processing centers where they'd be released to begin rebuilding their lives. During the Atlantic crossing, the women had time to reflect on their months of captivity. "We'd spent 6 months as American prisoners," Greta Hoffman wrote. 6 months of being fed, housed, treated with basic decency by people we'd been taught to fear. Now we were returning to the nation that had lied to us, that had sent us to war unprepared, that had committed atrocities while telling us we were fighting for civilization. The irony was overwhelming. The Germany they returned to in March 1946 was unrecognizable. Allied occupation controlled all aspects of life. Major cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced, hungry, traumatized. The Nazi system that had defined German identity for 12 years had collapsed, leaving a psychological void. How do you reconstruct identity when everything you were taught was propaganda? For the returning women, this devastation created impossible emotional landscape. They had survived, but survival brought guilt. Why had they lived when so many died? Why had they experienced kindness when their countrymen suffered? How could they explain that American captivity had been safer than serving Germany? Most scattered to different parts of Germany, returning to families who'd believed them dead. Greta found her parents alive, but her childhood home in Hamburg bombed to rubble. Inga discovered her family had fled east, and their fate was unknown. Marta returned to Munich to find her husband had died during the final months of fighting. For years, most stayed silent about their time at Fort Sheridan. Post-war Germany was consumed with rebuilding, with processing collective trauma, with navigating occupation. Admitting to having been captured was shameful enough without adding that capture had involved humanity from the enemy. The women folded those memories into private corners of their minds and focused on survival. But memory demands acknowledgement. In the 1960s, as Germany's economic miracle transformed the country and a new generation came of age without direct war experience, some of the women began talking. Greta Hoffmann published her memoir in 1968, explicitly titling it, "What the Propaganda Didn't Tell Us." It received modest attention. Germany was not yet ready for widespread examination of wartime mythology, but it circulated among veterans and historians as a counter-narrative. Inga Schmidt, who'd eaten the first donut that November morning, became a teacher in Berlin. She incorporated her experiences into lessons on critical thinking and propaganda analysis. "I teach my students to question what they're told," she explained in a 1975 interview. "I tell them how I believed Americans were monsters because that's all I was shown. I tell them about donuts. And I tell them that propaganda works by limiting information so thoroughly that you can't imagine alternatives. The antidote is curiosity, skepticism, and exposure to different perspectives." In 1978, 33 years after their capture, several women participated in a German television documentary about POW experiences. Their segment, showing elderly women describing breakfast with donuts, American nurses providing hygiene kits, Christmas carols sung across enemy lines, struck younger viewers as almost fantastical. The documentary also interviewed Captain Robert Walsh, by then retired and living in Massachusetts. Asked why he'd gone beyond minimal requirements in treating the German prisoners, he gave an answer that echoed across decades. "Those women were younger than my sister. They'd been lied to their entire lives, fed propaganda that turned them into servants of an evil system. But they were still human beings. Treating them decently wasn't about absolving Germany's guilt or ignoring what the Nazis did. It was about refusing to let war turn me into something I didn't want to be. We could beat Germany militarily while still honoring our own values. That's what separated us from them." The encounter between Walsh's humanity and the German women's propaganda-induced fear created ripples that extended far beyond 1945. Several women became active in peace and reconciliation movements. Others worked in German-American friendship organizations, building cultural bridges informed by their unexpected wartime bridge. Marta Vogel, the singer who'd performed Silent Night on Christmas Eve 1945, devoted her post-war career to teaching music to children. She died in 1989, shortly before the Berlin Wall fell. At her funeral, her daughter read from Marta's journal. "That Christmas Eve, singing for Americans who could have hated us but chose not to, taught me that music transcends politics. So does kindness. So does the choice to see humanity in people you're supposed to consider enemies. I've spent my life teaching children to make that choice because it's the only way we prevent future wars. When the last of the 43 women died in 2001, German historians noted that their generation carried unique psychological burdens: survivors of war, witnesses to defeat, recipients of enemy kindness that contradicted national mythology. They'd had to rebuild not just their country, but their understanding of truth, propaganda, and what it meant to be human in a world more complex than any ideology acknowledged. The story of those 43 women preparing for insults but receiving donuts reminds us that war's cruelties are choices, not inevitabilities. Captain Walsh and his staff chose humanity when they could have chosen indifference. The German women chose to question propaganda when they could have clung to familiar certainties. Both sides chose to see each other as people rather than categories. History remembers the battles, the political decisions, the strategic turning points. But transformation happens in smaller moments. A donut offered across enemy lines. Soap given because you're not animals. Christmas carols shared despite language barriers. These moments don't erase war's horrors or justify its existence. They simply prove that even in war's darkest chapters, human decency remains possible for those brave enough to practice it. The war ended twice for those 43 women, once when Germany surrendered, and again when they learned that the monsters of their nightmares were actually just people who brought donuts and coffee, and in doing so offered something more precious than freedom: the truth that propaganda had spent 12 years hiding. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simple kindness. And sometimes that's exactly what's needed to break through walls of hatred and help people remember they're human.